Introduce myself. I'm Joyce Maroney. I'm a trustee at the Athenaeum and one of the volunteers on the Cultural Programming Committee. And we are so thrilled this evening to bring you tonight's Summer Salon speech with, or talk with, historic paint expert Christine Thomson. Christine provides architectural paint analysis services for museums, historic sites, and private homeowners, including an analysis she did for us here at the Athenaeum in 2018. She's a graduate of University of California, Santa Barbara. She apprenticed in woodworking and wood finishing in California before moving to Boston in 1988. She was a senior furniture conservator at the SPNEA, now Historic New England Conservation Center, and senior conservator at the firm of Robert Mussey Associates in Boston. She's now self-employed in Salem, where she advises museums and private collectors. Tonight, Christine will be sharing her expertise with us and taking your questions. We will ask you to hold your questions until the end of the talk, at which point we will, and please, in the meantime, put your questions in the chat box, in the chat section, and we will address all of the questions at the end of the talk. So at this point, again, I'm going to thank you all for coming. I'm going to thank you, Christine, for coming, and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joyce. I am very excited to be able to talk about my favorite subject, or one of my favorite subjects. And I have lots of wonderful photos to show tonight. My PowerPoints are not fancy, I'll warn you, but I think they get the job done. So anyway, as Joyce mentioned, I worked for a while at the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, or SPNEA as we called it. It's now Historic New England. And in that time, in the 90s, late 80s and early 90s, a lot was going on with looking at architectural paint in a different way. And for a long time, the idea of using a paint cross section and looking at all the layers under the microscope was done by paintings conservators who worked on oil paintings. But the concept kind of got adopted at SPNEA when I was there, and we bought a big fancy microscope and we started doing architectural paint analysis in a more sophisticated way. And it was pretty exciting because nobody else was really doing it. And we were sort of, feeling our way along as we went. The interpretation of these cross sections is always a challenge. And we have been doing this now for, we've all been doing this for over 30 years. And I think it's just starting to make a little bit of sense. So I thought what I would do today is, oh, and thank you all for coming, by the way, because it's a beautiful Friday night and I'm actually quite touched that so many people showed up. I thought I would start a little bit by talking about paint technology. What is paint? How does it work? And then we can talk more about how the paint analysis works, how that is done. And lastly, I have a lot of projects to show you that I've done over the past few years in the Salem area. So some might be familiar to you. So let's begin here. So what is paint? Paint is pigment and binder mixed together. The binder is usually a liquid, and it could be an oil, it could be a hide glue, it could be a resin like shellac mixed with alcohol, it could be an egg, it can be all kinds of things. But its purpose is to hold the paint particles, the pigment particles together so that they can be applied to a surface and that they'll actually stick on the surface. So this is the way paint used to be made. In the 18th century and into the 19th century, all paints, architectural paints, were hand ground. And that is to say, you got your muller, which is this tool here, and you got a slab of either marble or glass, and you sprinkle the pigment on there and put the linseed oil or whatever the other binder that you might be using, and you ground away until it was a nice smooth paste. And you can imagine this was a pretty time-consuming endeavor. And it wasn't really until the 1860s or the 70s that actually paints were actually available in cans. So prior to that, all paints were hand ground and hand mixed, and pigments were in batches and little batches. And this will become clearer as we talk about paint analysis, but it's always tricky because the paint analyst can look at 20 different places and get 20 different colors. So that's the challenge of paint analysis, is to come in somewhere in the middle. Let's see here. Pigments. 18th century, all house paint pigments were pretty much earth pigments taken out of the, mined from the earth, ochres, umbers, burnt sienna, raw sienna. Black was not mined, but usually it was made of soot, or what they called furnace black, which was the soot from fire. Or there was also bone black. The burning of bones and grinding them would create a black that wasn't as dark as the soot black, but it was still used a lot in architectural paint because it was easy to make. And the white component in the 18th century was lead. So we have lead carbonate mixed into a paste and diluted with turpentine. And the paste was often used in architectural painting because they knew then, even in the 18th century, that the lead made the paint so much more durable. So what they would do is they would take, in fact, this picture that I just showed you, he probably has lead white in here, along with pigment and along with turpentine, to get the consistency that can be brushed. So here's an example of just the arrays of ochres. So imagine, this color plus the lead white, you're going to get pink. And actually pink was a very popular color in the mid to late 18th and early 19th century. And it was because they took a simple ochre, added lead white to it, and the result was actually a nice pink color. The greens, I'm showing you these earthy greens here. These are actually from the most wonderful catalog in the world called Kramer Pigments, Kremer. And they supply pigments to anybody who wants them, artists, people who make their own paint, and they have the most obscure, interesting, fascinating pigments in one place that you'll ever see. But this is what was available in the 18th century as far as greens go. I mean, they weren't particularly vibrant. They were kind of earthy. Some had sort of a brown cast to them, like this one up here. And but that said, they also made greens from mixing yellow and black together, and you get kind of a muddy green. And that was a very common early pigment, working with what they had. And it's really before synthetic pigments came about. I'm showing you this, this amazing overmantel. This is from an incredible house outside of Charleston, South Carolina, called Drayton Hall, and it belongs to the National Trust. And we were involved in a paint study there many years ago. And what we found in this particular room, this wasn't the case in all rooms, but in this particular room, this woodwork, which, mind you, was made in the early 1740s, late 30s, early 40s, had one coat of paint on it. Not one coat exactly, one generation of paint. It had a primer, and then it had a couple finish coats, and nobody ever painted over it. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing. What you're seeing here, this dark red, is the wood showing through, and the wood that they used to make the paneling was red cedar. So that's why you kind of have this reddish cast to it. But it's really astounding to see this still preserved. And the National Trust, in their wisdom, made the conscious choice to not repaint these rooms. And I think that's really fantastic, because this is a glimpse into the past that hardly you ever get to see. The color is probably pretty close to what it was. It's probably an ochre mixed with lead white. In the period, it was called stone color. Any ochre, any kind of ochre, stony color plus lead white made what they called stone. And that's what you see a lot in architectural finishes from, I'd say, the 1730s to all the way to the 19th century. It's a digression. So paint analysis. This is the old way. This is how paint analysis used to be done, and it definitely had its merits. You could see, you would get out your sandpaper and sand away, and you'd make a bullet, what they called a bullseye, and it would reveal all the layers in stratigraphy here. See, the darkest one at the bottom, here's the wood, and then you've got this sort of tan color, and then you've got some whites. And I took a cross-section sample of this because I wanted to show that this technique is useful, particularly if you're trying to figure out what the original surface looked like. But in actual fact, if you look over at my cross sections here, we have two. We have one that was made in visible light, and the bottom one was made in ultraviolet light. It's the same sample, but we do that because there are things that show up in ultraviolet light that you do not see in visible light. So it can be very helpful. It can add more information to what you already know. But the reality here is that we've got this dark brown layer, which here is reading a little bit orange, but it's actually the first generation. The wood would be here. And then you've got like gray, and then you've got a white, and then, hold on here. Then you've got, these various off-white colors all the way to the top. And so it gives much more information than this old technique of just sanding. And also, if you have, for instance, if you have marbleizing or graining or glazes, and we'll talk about glazes later, it will be much more evident in these cross sections than it will be using this method. So the cross sections are very basic. Here's one on the right. It's got the little piece of paint in there. And what I do is I get these little ice trays. Remember these things from the 1970s? These little teeny ice cube trays, and I drop the sample. I fill them halfway full of resin. I drop the sample in, and then I pour in the rest of the resin. And then when it's cured, I can pop them out, and I can cut through the face of the little cube using, I've got a sander and then these mesh sanding papers. And then I can expose the little paint sample in cross section with the paint at the wood and the paint at the, the wood at the bottom, and then going up through the layers. It's like a layer cake. So it's very kind of low tech, but it works really well. And here's the setup that I have in my studio. The microscope on the left is a binocular microscope, and I use that for when I first get my samples back into the lab and I want to go through, sort through them, and maybe choose some little pieces for embedding in resin. So I use this microscope, but this is even more important when it comes to color matching, because this microscope has this sort of fancy light ring at the bottom that's color corrected. So it makes for a really uncluttered color matching. So my color matching is generally done, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I generally done using standard commercial color swatches. I mostly use Benjamin Moore. Occasionally I'll stray into other companies' color palettes if I can't find like a perfect match. This is my fancy microscope. This is an Olympus series, BH series 2. It has this capability of using ultraviolet light. Here's the little ultraviolet light box here. And there's a really weird looking, what do you call it? Lamp inside that glows. So that provides the UV light, and it goes up through the machine and then ends up on the sample. The sample sits here. So I can photograph everything in 4 different, I have 50x all the way through 400x. So it's been great. And it makes the paint analysis and looking at those things a lot more, you can see a lot more detail and definition than you can with just the binocular microscope. So here's another paint cross section that I did recently. Michael Selps came by and dropped off a piece of the ballroom plaster at Hamilton Hall. And so I put it in a little cube of resin, and I prepared it and I looked at it, and this is what is on the walls at Hamilton Hall. We have plaster down here. We have a sealing coat of probably, they used to use like hide glue or some kind of glue. And then this is the first generation paint in Hamilton Hall. And from there, it goes all the way through these tans, lavender, a pale blue, back to yellow, this dark kind of brown color, kind of a pinky brown, and then up through the current layer, which is up here, which is kind of an off-white. So I thought this was really interesting because this color looks very much like chrome yellow. And chrome yellow was discovered in about 1803 maybe, and became a commercial paint pigment a few years later. And it certainly makes a statement. This is an era when there weren't that many bright colors, and I'm sure when they saw this, they just couldn't believe how fabulous it was, and therefore became the first paint treatment on the Hamilton Hall plaster walls. This down here is just a little, these are my little fan deck. I don't have fan decks. I use these paint company swatches that are on a ring so that I can take them out and put them under the microscope and make sure that I get the closest match to the color that I am looking at. So that's Hamilton Hall. So that was kind of exciting to see that. This color, we're going to talk a little bit more about pigments here. This color is Prussian Blue. And Prussian Blue was it's the first synthetic pigment that was ever made. It was made by a German guy, and it's iron oxide based, but it can be produced in the laboratory. And it can be produced in large quantities for not very much money. And so it was a real boon to paint technology because you could turn white lead paint, these beautiful robin's egg blue colors, with very little pigment. It had very strong, it was very intense pigment. And you could create these beautiful blues that nobody had really ever seen before. There were blues like azurite and indigo that were used as paint pigments, but they tended to not be so stable. They were more fugitive, they would fade with the light. So when Prussian Blue came along, people went crazy, and so did George Washington, because this is his parlor. And this is the first generation color on his parlor walls. And I think that's kind of amazing that he was such a fashionista, I guess you would say. So here's my little sample of lead white. No, I didn't use lead white. I used titanium white and I used Prussian blue, and I used like smaller than the head of a pin, just a tiny, tiny drop from this bottle. And I got this beautiful blue color. So it was really a remarkable pigment when it came along. And so that's why we paint analysts see a lot of blues early on, like from, around 1790 to all through the 19th century. The pigment itself is super dark blue. And the funny part about it is if you mix it with oil, if you grind it up with oil, it turns black. And it makes a really beautiful black. And I've seen painted furniture that uses the Prussian blue black for their black instead of using one of the more traditional blacks, because it's just much deeper and stronger. So it's an amazing pigment. Here's another fabulous room. And amazingly, this too is at Mount Vernon, where the last image was. This is what they call the small dining room. And this pigment, the pigment that was used to create these walls is a copper carbonate byproduct of copper corrosion called verdigris. And verdigris as a pigment wasn't particularly stable, but when it was fresh and new, it created this amazing green, much more exciting than the greens I showed you earlier that are kind of muted and dull. But this, I guess, would knock people's socks off. And so George Washington was right there with them. He had this room done in what we call Verdigris Treatment, which was incredibly popular. And I have seen it many, many times on woodwork dating from 1750 to right up to 1800 as the first generation. In fact, our house on Essex Street, which the early part is 1750, I found it in an upstairs bedroom. So there you go. It seems to be very, very common. And what it consisted of was this ground up pigment, which was very coarse and not very grindable, mixed with a little lead white to get a nice green. And then followed by that, they made a varnish with that same green pigment. So the varnish is made up of oil plus a resin, heated up and mixed together. And then this pigment was thrown in, but not enough to make it an opaque paint layer. It was more like a glaze layer. And a glaze is when you can brush on top of a paint layer a thin coat that is semi-transparent, so you can see through. It's translucent, you can see through it, and the color from underneath comes through. So you have a very interesting surface with a lot of depth and a lot of character, much more so than just a plain old single paint layer. So this is a house that I am currently working on in Newport, Rhode Island. It's the Vernon House on Clark Street, and it has quite a grand 1760s Georgian interior. And we went up, I went up to the second bedroom and I started poking around, and sure enough, what do we have? We've got the Verdigris Treatment as the first generation. So here it is. Here's the this is the primer here. This is the first ground layer. This is the green mixed with white. You can see the white colored white dots, the big green chunks that look like bowling balls. And then these two brown layers are varnish layers. And what happens to oil varnishes over time is that they turn brown. And so that's kind of sad, but that's the way it's always been. And so this was probably looking really fabulous for maybe 10 years or so. And then it slowly started to turn. And so by the time these varnishes are dark, it is really dark. And you can see they put like a nice thick layer of like a nice cream color on top of it. They were probably pretty sick of the dark color. So that was exciting to find. A little closer to home, you may recognize this room. This is the parlor at the House of the Seven Gables. And in 2002, I was involved in a paint study there. And sure enough, we found a verdigris treatment on these walls that were probably installed around 1750. And the verdigris treatment, of course, was painted over with many layers of paint. If you look over in this there's a little window, what we call a window here, where I had gone in and scraped away all the layers on top to reveal the first and second layers of paint. So they kept that as a record of what it looked like originally. So here's an expanded image of the little window that I did. And you can see how dark the verdigris treatment is. It's almost black. So of course they painted over it. You know, it was probably pretty depressing after about 10 or 15 years. So this is the second generation, this kind of peachy tan color. But what this is in 2002, I made mock-ups of the verdigris treatments. And so I took different pigments. I have a couple of different verdigris, and I have what they call copper resonate, which is verdigris pigment suspended in oil. And I just sort of started playing around with them and creating these swatches with the gray ground layer, which is what the cross sections told us. There was a gray ground, and then this green color was put on top. And then there were several layers of varnish on top, which is why it turned this color. But this sample was done at the same time. And I did not use modern pigment. I used the verdigris, but I used alkyd varnish, which I guess is probably almost obsolete now because everybody's going to water-based varnishes. But I think you can still buy an alkyd varnish. It doesn't yellow very much. It has a sunblock in it, so that helps prevent damage by light. And so these guys looked sort of like this when I did it 20 years ago. And so this is just in 20 years, just sitting around in my studio, that this is what happens. So it's a really good, I mean, we knew it did, but you know, here's the proof here. We got this amazing guy, a decorative painter, Nigel Grace, who sadly has left this earth, but he did the treatment, and he put down the gray layer first, and then there was not one, but I think two separate varnish layers of this translucent glaze layer on top. And it is lovely because you can see the streaks, you know, on the panels, and it's just got a subtle, interesting surface that, as I mentioned before, you wouldn't just get slapping a coat of paint or a coat or two of paint on there. So it's the translucency of the varnishes that really makes it special. Also in the gables, this is an incredible, behind the door, there is a cabinet, and this cabinet is contemporary with the woodwork, and it has its original paint. But surprisingly, it's not the verdigris treatment that we're finding on the walls. This was actually Prussian blue. Okay, and then this red was gold leaf with a varnish on top. So the varnish has turned brown, making it look like this. And the oil component in the Prussian blue, which I'm assuming was Prussian blue and lead white mixed together, the oil component has turned brown, which has made the color look green, okay? And it wasn't until we took a tiny sample and looked at it under the microscope that we said, oh my gosh, it was blue. So there you go. So sometimes it can be misleading. You have to be careful that you get good samples where you can get like inside the paint and not have the oxidized surface informing what color it might be. This little rim here, the shelf, was also gilded. So it must have been quite something. And I think the Gables has a little, they have a little mock-up of what the colors looked like originally that you can see inside the cabinet. So that was a really exciting project. And as I said, we just keep finding verdigris everywhere. It's just so, it was just so fashionable. Before we talk about what we did at the Athenaeum, I wanted to talk a little bit about white paints, because the white paints are the bane of the paint analyst, because they are really hard to discern one from the other. Any paint with any of these pigments and linseed oil will turn a tan color over time. And so it can be very misleading when you're looking at the samples under the microscope, what color they are. Did they start out white, or do they have color now? It all takes the microscope to help figure that out. Fortunately, they fluoresce differently. So when we have these leaded zincs, which are the most common, this is a combination of zinc and lead. Zinc oxide gets discovered in about it says here 1840, but somewhere in there. And that was a bright new pigment that wasn't toxic. So that was a big deal, and that got to be very popular, but it did not have the durability that lead did. In the 1900s, they were using barium sulfate, and that too is a nice white pigment, but again, it does not have the capacity to last a long time. And then titanium dioxide comes along in 1920. And if any of you know titanium dioxide, it is a white. It is so white that it's almost a blue white. And the modern paints use titanium dioxide to tint with their tints to make their colors. And it has a very unique color by itself as a paint, but also fortunately in ultraviolet light, it has a very distinctive fluorescence. So that helps me figure out where the titanium dioxide is. And if it's got titanium dioxide, if the layer shows this rose violet color that we know isn't this one, it's more this dark, then we know that paint layer went on after 1920. I get asked a lot about how can you use this to date layers, and if only I wish I could say yes, it's such a great tool. But the fact is, I can't really date layers, particularly architectural paint layers, because the pigments can be identified, but if they're earth pigments, the earth pigments have been around for forever. So it doesn't really tell us anything. But if you had something like the chrome yellow, we know if a layer is chrome yellow, then it has to be around 1800. And then it was not a color that you would see in the 18th century. So it does help date a little bit if you can do pigment identification, which is also a microscopy technique. These two images are from one of the painted columns in the portico of the Athenaeum. And the two photographs, the photograph on the left, the wood would be here, but the paint came off right at the wood layer. So I know that the wood was here. And it had all these layers on top. And they all look like, white. It's hard to tell. But when you photograph them in ultraviolet, this is the same sample. You see more definition between the layers. You can see there's a line here, which you can barely see here. So we've got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 or 16 layers of paint were on those columns. And some of the columns have been stripped too. So that's always makes paint analysts crazy, because you have to make sure you're getting a full stratigraphy. And you can't obviously get one from a stripped area. You can only get the layers that were put on after stripping. So so that was really helpful, using the UV light to try to figure out, first of all, how many layers and what the paints were. This kind of suggests what the paints were made of too. So I color matched to the actual color of the first generation. We made, the Athenaeum made the choice that they wanted the first generation paint color from 1906. So I matched many samples to the first generation. And as I was mentioning earlier, no two samples are alike. And so this was kind of the range of colors that I was getting. So how do I know that the tan color was not the original color? Well, what I have to do is I have to go back to my samples, and I look at my samples in super high power magnification, 400, and I can see the pigment particles then. And if this were a tan color, we would see like chunks of red or brown or black or a mixture or some pigment that would get us to this tan. But I looked and looked and looked, and I did not see any pigment particles other than the white. So that tells me that this is a shift from the oil-based paint binder, the binder that is causing this color shift. So then comes the challenging part. It's the prerogative, I guess, of the paint analyst to try to extrapolate away from what it's become to what it hopefully would have been. And we know that lead white, when mixed up with linseed oil, has kind of a warm white color. And but it's still a color. As you can see, this is the white of the paper. I mean, it's a pretty dramatic color still. But anyway, this is the color that we went with. And when you see the portico now, this looks white. This color looks white, but it's a soft, warm white. It is not the white of titanium dioxide, which is what the columns were previously. They had like this bluish white look to them. And that certainly is not a period color, as you know, titanium dioxide doesn't come around till about 1920. So the stucco of the walls at the Athenaeum were much more straightforward, I'm happy to say. And this is the stucco here. This is a little bit of seal coat on the stucco. And here's our first generation tan color right here, followed by a gray and a couple of off-whites, and then a really white up at the top here. And remember, I mentioned that titanium dioxide fluoresces this purple color. So if you look here, here's that purpley color here. So we can bet that the pigment in here is titanium dioxide. I'm not quite sure about this layer. This has a little bit of a different look, more like zinc. So this could be zinc white layer. But anyway, so the color we matched to was this first generation from 1906. And those were the options. And I think we went with this one. This was the final choice. I did mock-ups on the actual wall. And it was probably between these two. This was sort of a bleached out version of what the color, I think the color became oxidized as it was exposed to light, and it loses some of its intensity. So I think that sample was taken from an area that might have been a little bit of bleached out, but you can see we're sort of in the ballpark here. So lastly, I wanted to just show these photos that Jean Marie was able to send to me, which were really fun. This is a black and white of the Athenaeum after it was completed, and you can see that there might be a color here. This is, what can be so frustrating because, there's not a lot of color photography to help us see how things used to look. But that said, I do see that there's a color here that is in contrast to the columns. And then she also sent me these postcards, and believe it or not, this little area here behind the portico on the back side of it is tan, light tan. So I think we're in the ballpark with our choices. So here we go. Here's the before, taken in, I think it was 2019. And then here is a recent photo. And I hope you agree, but I think that it really works with the color of the brick and just the warmth of all the colors together. I think looks really beautiful. So I'm happy, and I hope you all are too. And that's about it. I'd love to entertain questions if anybody has any.
I have a few questions while we wait for audience members to supply their own. Actually, one audience member already asked, what is ochre?
Ochre is an earth. It's a pigment that's mined from the earth. It's an iron oxide mineral. And it gets ground up and purified to some degree. And it has a color range from bright red, like an intense red, all the way to yellows and to greens. So it's the chemical makeup of the material that gives it the name ochre. But it can vary vastly from area to area, depending on where it comes from. Ochre has been traditionally mined in Europe, but now there's been a lot of ochre pigment coming out of China now. And I don't know much about ochre mining in the US, although I'm sure that there must be ochre deposits.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting. It seems like the projects you've shown us, the underlying woodwork was in reasonably good condition, which makes me wonder how rough does the condition of the substrate, the wall or the furniture, whatever, have to be for you not to be able to do some level of analysis?
I have always maintained that if you look long enough and hard enough, you'll find a crack or a crevice with paint in it. Exterior paint analysis is particularly difficult because paints flake off of buildings, particularly in the outdoors when they're exposed to the weather. And it's not unusual to let a building completely go back to raw wood and then start painting it again. So it's always a dicey prospect to get a full stratigraphy from an exterior site. But if you look cracks and crevices, if you look like under the eaves, that's a really great place because it's actually more protected there. You can hopefully find the full paint history.
Okay.
And why are we doing this? I mean, we're doing this because it's helpful to document what was there. Maybe nobody's really interested right now, but maybe in a few years, somebody might want to know, like, what was the paint history here?
Thank you. So we have another question here, a two-part question, which is, what is burnt sienna? And this person also wants you to know that the new paint treatment at the Athenaeum looks great.
Oh, thanks. We can thank Kevin for that, actually. Burnt sienna is another iron oxide mineral. And just like ochre, it is mined out of the earth. It is ground up, purified, and sold as a pigment. And the raw sienna is a yellow color. And when you put it in the oven and toast it, it turns this warm yellow brown color. So that's what when you have raw sienna and burnt sienna, it's the same mineral ground up, but it's the burnt has been treated. And the same with the umbers too. Raw umber is raw. It looks like dirt because it is kind of dirt actually. And then the burnt umber is a much browner, warmer, burned looking color.
Okay, thank you. David wants to know if you are familiar with Homewood, the 1801 Maryland house that the Athenaeum was designed to emulate. He says it also has had extensive paint analysis. The columns have been repainted in more than a white. I'm not sure.
I have had
He
the
meant
pleasure of,
tan. He corrects his typo later, tan, more tan than white.
Oh, in more tan than white. Okay.
well, you know, it's very possible that it was that early paint analysis, you know, of the bullseye variety may have misconstrued the original color, just like I was talking about earlier. It may have been white, but it may have turned tan because of the linseed oil component. So I have not seen, I've had the pleasure of visiting Homewood, which is a wonderful house, but I have not seen a paint analysis of that house. And it would be very interesting to see. I mean, the technology has changed a lot. People have been doing paint analysis on buildings for, you know, 50 years, but I think the technology is really, well, obviously has improved greatly.
Okay. Next question. Have you worked with pre-1830 murals?
Pre-1830 murals. I have worked on 1830 murals, like of the Rufus Porter variety. And those paints are always really interesting because they're distempers. And Rufus Porter, actually, he was a scientist too. He actually writes out all the recipes. So that's kind of fun because you can actually recreate them. Prior to that, let me tell you about my project again in Newport, Rhode Island. The Vernon House has a room that, unfortunately, I don't have a photo to show you. So I apologize about that, but I think you can go online and find it. The Vernon House has murals on plaster that were discovered behind the woodworking. So the woodworking was put in, the paneling, raised paneling was put in this room in 1760. And then in 1937, there was a leak or something, a pipe had a leak in it, and they had to remove one of the panels, and they found these murals. And the murals are this like a Chinese scene. It's like a Chinese Coromandel screen with all these Chinese people doing all these things and all this architecture and birds and flowers. And it is just amazing. And we are dating this mural. It's been restored a couple times. It's in really good condition right now. We are dating these to about 1710. So paint on plaster rarely survives. I'm sure it was done more often, but this is the earliest paint on plaster that I have ever seen or know about. And I did a sort of literature search trying to find earlier examples, and I could not find anything. The Warner House, the McPhaedrus Warner House up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, has the most fabulous murals. And those two are thought to be early 18th century. But those are really the only two that I'm aware of. If anybody knows of anybody, I would sure like to hear about it. So.
Thank you. We have a question here. I presume this is related to the Athenaeum paint job. And that is, did you use oil-based paint or latex? Was an undercoat used? Nancy, that's your question. So is that about the Athenaeum or a different, or more generally speaking?
I did not spec the type of paint. I just spec the colors.
Okay.
So that's a Kevin question. And I'm assuming that they're acrylic based paints. And you know what the paint store says, you can put acrylic over oil, but you can't put oil over acrylic. So hopefully we're not going to see too much of a color shift over time with these colors. And if a primer was put, I would expect a primer was put down, because that's sort of standard painting practice to, when you change a color, to put a primer down. So.
What's the most surprising project you've ever worked on, in terms of maybe you went into it thinking you were going to find one thing and it was something wonderfully different? Yeah.
Well, I've done a lot of work at the Old Manse in Concord, which is another one of my all-time favorite historic houses. And that house had just plain old regular woodwork with like a ochre color paint on it. And we started digging around and we found a bright pink glaze. And I mean bright pink, like red hot pink on a pink ground. So it's sort of the pink equivalent of the verdigris. It's got a pink ground with lead white in it. And then it's somebody dragged over like a red dye almost to make it even more intense. And I mean, this was Concord, this was a minister's house. I mean, come on. So it's a bit of a mystery as to why this would be so colorful, but it's probably about 1800, 1810 maybe. Who knows? Everybody has their taste. So there you go. That was probably the most like, what kind of project?
So, you've mentioned certain pigments like lead, which are generally prohibited now. Are there any historical colors or palettes that you can't really recreate because of environmental or other contemporary restraints?
You can't get certain pigments. And a really good example, remember I mentioned in my talk, I said greens were tough. It was hard to get a great green until they discovered arsenic green in the 19th century. And that made a pretty fabulous green. And it was also used as a wallpaper paint. So it was used as a block printed, to block print wallpaper. And it is toxic as all get out. And I don't know, like the story, I don't know if people started getting sick or what, but they finally figured out that it was not a pigment that you wanted to be living with.
Yeah.
And so you can't even, I don't even think Kramer sells arsenic. They used to, but I think they don't do it anymore. And there are some pigments that you just can't get anymore. Kramer has really tried to get, have stocks of obscure and old fashioned and hard to get pigments, but a lot of times they're very expensive. There's an amazing pigment collection at Harvard at the Fogg Museum, the George Stout collection. And he spent his life collecting pigments and they're all there. I don't know if they're on public view, but I think there's a lot that's written about them. And he has some amazing, amazing things that you can't get anymore. So I think it's a really interesting subject. There's a couple of websites. A couple of pigment crazy people have started these websites where they've compiled all this information about the different ones, and it's just things about them, like are they available, like what their chemical composition is, and what their names were. That's a whole other weird thing, is all the pigments have had different names over the years, starting in the 15th and 16th century. And there's some books, in fact I have one that documents all the names of these pigments. You can identify them by their chemical composition, but then they've had a strew of different names. So that's an interesting kind of elusive topic related to pigments.
So Karen has an interesting comment here, given your comment about the pink pigment in Concord. She says, given the robust history of sailing and trade in Salem's history, have you found that the exposure to other cultures resulted in an expanded color palette?
That's a good question. The color vermilion was considered to be an exotic pigment. And that came through the China trade to Europe and America. And it's a drop dead gorgeous red. And it did influence. And, you know, I've read a lot of sort of primary document recipes about what was available and how to make certain colors. And so we know what was available to people. And every once in a while, you'll see something kind of exotic that you know didn't come from around here, or that you know is not an earth pigment that was typically used. So I think it's always been kind of like an elusive thing, but I don't know if it really does. I can't say for sure if it really influenced, but everything influences everything, you know, when people come here from other countries, you know, things change, so.
Exactly. So Elizabeth asked, has interpretation of microscopic analysis changed much since you started doing it at SPNA? And did you know back then about the degree to which oil changed the original color?
We knew a little bit, but there have been people that have tried to sort of quantify the change by doing test samples and then putting them in a machine called a weatherometer, which is like an accelerated aging machine, and makes them turn dark and tracks the rate of change. So there's been a lot of sort of scientific analysis done on that phenomenon. But it still doesn't help us when it comes to each specific project, because we never really know, like, well, how much light did it have? How much linseed oil did it have in it? You know, so there's all these variables that make it hard to pinpoint it. But there is a lot more known now. And, you know, the identification of pigments now has become quite simple because we have a tool called X-ray fluorescence. And they have these portable machines that you could just come to the site, hold the little machine up to the wall or the paint, and it will tell you what elements are present. And from that information, you can extrapolate, therefore, what pigments would be there. So there's a lot more scientific analysis going into it than ever before. But a lot of times my clients just want to know, what color was it?
Yeah.
They don't want to know any of the fancy, like, don't tell me what kind of pigment. I don't know. I don't need to know all that. You know, just tell me what color it was. So
are new people coming into the field of paint analysis? And if they are, what disciplines are they coming from?
I sure hope so. There are preservation programs around the country. The University of Pennsylvania program is probably one of the best known. The art conservation program at Winterthur trains art conservators, and paint analysis is a part of that training. You will also find paint analysis training, I think, at the SUNY Buffalo Art Conservation Program. There's one there. There's one in Queens in Ontario, Canada, a really great program. And the Park Service has a training center down in Louisiana. They teach paint analysis, but there's all different degrees of it too. I mean, you can take a sample and embed it and look at it under the microscope, but it's the interpretation that is really the really key, tricky part. And there are no books on that.
Yeah.
You know, and that's always something that I debate with my colleagues with, you know, it's like, I think it's this. Well, they think, no, I think it's this. So there's a lot of uncertainty between that and the fact that it's very hard to get an exact match of anything, makes it kind of an inexact science, shall we say.
So we are a little past 6:30. I did want to note in the comments that Kevin, can you raise your hand? I think that's you in the orange shirt on my screen. Yeah. Who did the painting. Kevin does want to thank you for the beautiful colors. He's also indicating here that he puts a coat of oil primer and 2 to 3 coats of latex, and that every inch of all of the wood you see in the paint job on the Athenaeum is primed. So there's your artist who was nice enough to join us this evening. So we really appreciate everybody coming. Looks like most people stayed for the duration, which is always a great sign of interest. We encourage you all to keep coming back to salemathenaeum.net and check out the calendar of events. Obviously, we have an ongoing program here. We hope you're all signed up for the newsletter. Follow us on social media if you're on social media. I think we've got one more salon this summer, and then in September we'll be having the annual literary festival, September 9 through 12. So